The parking lot outside the community center was unusually full that afternoon, the kind of crowded chaos that came with weekend events and limited spaces. I had arrived early for a scheduled meeting, but even then, I noticed something immediately off. Right near the front entrance, in bright blue paint with clear signage, was the handicapped parking spot. And sitting squarely in it was a luxury SUV with no permit displayed, no placard hanging from the mirror, and no special license plate. It wasn't a subtle mistake. It was blatant. People noticed too. A few residents slowed as they passed, glancing from the sign to the windshield, then shaking their heads. One older man muttered under his breath about entitlement. A woman using a cane stopped a little farther away, clearly frustrated, scanning the lot for alternatives. The situation was uncomfortable, and everyone seemed to be waiting to see what would happen next. Then the driver appeared. Karen stepped out of the SUV with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life. Designer sunglasses, phone pressed to her ear, keys dangling from her fingers. She didn't look around to check the sign. She didn't hesitate. She simply locked the car and walked toward the building as if the space belonged to her by default. Someone finally spoke up. A man near the entrance called out, calm but firm, asking if she had a permit for the spot. Karen stopped, turned slowly, and looked at him like he'd insulted her. She gestured vaguely at the lot and snapped back that she would only be a minute and that there were plenty of other spaces. The man pointed out the sign again. She rolled her eyes, waved him off, and continued inside. The tension lingered after she disappeared through the doors. Conversations sparked quietly. People debated whether to report it, whether it was worth the trouble, whether anyone would actually do anything. The woman with the cane eventually parked far from the entrance, leaning heavily on her car for support. That moment alone shifted the mood from annoyance to quiet anger. Unbeknownst to Karen, someone had already made a call. Not out of spite, but because the rules around handicapped parking exist for a reason. While the meeting inside began, the parking lot remained under watchful eyes. And about 15 minutes later, a patrol car rolled in slowly, lights off but unmistakable. Conversations outside stopped. A few people exchanged knowing looks. The officer stepped out, calm and methodical, scanning the lot. His eyes went straight to the SUV. He checked the windshield, walked around the vehicle, and confirmed what everyone already knew. No permit. No exemption. Just a clear violation. He pulled out his notepad and began writing. Word spread quickly inside the building. Whispers traveled row by row until Karen noticed the shift in attention. Someone leaned over and told her there was a police officer outside looking at her car. She laughed at first, dismissive, insisting it must be a mistake. But when she glanced through the window and saw the patrol car, her smile faltered. She stood up abruptly, knocking her chair back, and marched toward the exit. The room fell silent as she left. Outside, the officer was still writing, unhurried, focused, completely unimpressed. Karen approached with indignation already bubbling over, clearly expecting to talk her way out of it. What she didn't realize was that this wasn't going to be one of those moments where confidence and volume won the day. This was about to become a lesson she, and everyone watching, would not forget. Karen stormed across the parking lot like she owned it, heels clicking sharply against the pavement, phone already in her hand as if it were a weapon. She didn't approach the officer with curiosity or concern. She approached with accusation. Her first words weren't a greeting or a question, but a demand. She insisted there had been a misunderstanding and that the ticket better not be for her vehicle. The officer looked up slowly, calm and unreadable, and asked a single question, whether she had a valid handicapped permit. Karen scoffed. She gestured vaguely toward the building and explained that she was attending an important meeting, that she was running late, and that the spot had been empty anyway. She added that she would only be a minute, as if time limits somehow overrode posted law. The officer listened without interruption, then pointed to the sign painted clearly on the ground and mounted at eye level. He explained, evenly and without emotion, that handicapped parking spots are reserved exclusively for vehicles displaying proper permits, regardless of how long someone plans to stay. Karen's tone shifted from dismissive to defensive. She crossed her arms and said the rule was ridiculous, arguing that no one had been using the spot when she arrived. She claimed she didn't see the sign, despite the blue paint and symbol beneath her tires. A small crowd began to form at a distance, residents exiting the building, curious neighbors, and the woman with the cane who had parked far away earlier. The mood was no longer awkward. It was expectant. The officer asked Karen for her license and registration. She hesitated, clearly offended by the request, but complied. As he reviewed the documents, he asked again whether she had any permit at all, temporary, permanent, or otherwise. Karen shook her head, then quickly added that she had knee problems and that she shouldn't need to prove anything to anyone. The officer nodded politely and explained that without an official permit issued by the state, personal claims of discomfort did not grant legal access to restricted parking. Karen's voice grew louder. She accused the officer of harassment, suggested he had better things to do, and implied that she knew people on the HOA board who would not be happy about this interaction. The officer remained unmoved. He calmly informed her that misuse of a handicapped parking space carried a significant fine and potential towing, depending on local regulations. At the mention of towing, Karen's confidence cracked just slightly. She tried a different tactic. Smiling tightly, she suggested that a warning would be more appropriate, given that it was her first time and that she was a law-abiding citizen. The officer paused, then gestured toward the woman with the cane, who was now watching openly. He explained that the purpose of the law was to ensure accessibility for those who needed it, and that warnings did not undo the inconvenience or harm caused. The silence that followed was heavy. Karen glanced around, realizing too late that the audience was no longer sympathetic. People weren't watching for drama anymore. They were watching for accountability. The officer finished writing, tore the ticket cleanly from his pad, and handed it to her. He explained the fine amount, the appeal process, and the consequences of ignoring it. His tone was professional, almost gentle, which somehow made the moment hit harder. Karen stared at the ticket, as if it were an insult made tangible. She muttered under her breath, snatched it from his hand, and accused him of making her an example. He replied calmly that she had done that herself. With that, he returned to his patrol car, leaving Karen standing alone in the handicapped spot she had assumed was hers. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the lesson lingered. This wasn't just about a ticket. It was about entitlement meeting reality and losing. Karen didn't leave the parking lot right away. She stood there for a moment, staring at the ticket like it might dissolve if she glared hard enough. Her face flushed, jaw tight, shoulders rigid. You could almost see the calculations happening in her head, whether to argue more, call someone higher up, or retreat before things got worse. Eventually, pride won over logic. She climbed back into her SUV and slammed the door hard enough to echo across the lot. Instead of driving off, she rolled down the window and began making an animated phone call. Her voice carried easily, sharp and indignant, describing the situation in exaggerated terms. She painted herself as the victim of an overzealous cop, claimed the space was basically unused, and insisted she was being targeted unfairly. A few people passing by caught fragments of the conversation and exchanged knowing looks. No one stepped in to defend her. That silence spoke volumes. The woman with the cane finally made her way toward the entrance, passing directly behind Karen's vehicle. Karen noticed her then, really noticed her for the first time. Their eyes met briefly. The woman didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The quiet disapproval in her expression landed harder than any lecture could have. Karen looked away first. Inside the building, the meeting had resumed, but the energy was different. The incident had become the unspoken focus. People whispered about what they'd seen, about the officer's calm response, about how rare it was to see someone like Karen actually face consequences. A few attendees shared their own stories of similar behavior: parking violations, line cutting, rules bent whenever convenience demanded it. There was a sense of collective validation, as if something long overdue had finally happened. About 10 minutes later, the patrol car was still in the lot, the officer finishing notes on his tablet. Karen exited her SUV again, this time more subdued. She approached cautiously, no longer shouting, and asked a question that sounded more like a complaint wrapped in politeness. She wanted to know if there was any way to fix the situation. The officer explained, patiently, that once a citation was issued, it stood. Any disputes would need to go through the proper appeal channels. There were no shortcuts. That was the moment the reality truly sank in. There would be no exception, no last-minute override, no magic phrase to undo the mistake. Karen nodded stiffly, thanked him through clenched teeth, and walked away without another word. She left the lot shortly after, tires squealing slightly as she pulled out, the blue handicapped spot finally empty again. The officer remained a few more minutes, checking the area, then drove off. The lot returned to normal, but something had shifted. People parked with more care. A few glanced at the handicap sign with renewed awareness. Rules that had once felt abstract were suddenly tangible, backed by consequence and clarity. Later, outside the building, small groups lingered and talked. The woman with the cane was offered help, doors were held open, conversations were kinder. The incident had done more than punish one person, it had reminded everyone why the rule existed in the first place. Accessibility wasn't a suggestion. It was a necessity. As for Karen, her absence was noticeable. Someone mentioned seeing her SUV circle the block earlier, clearly avoiding the lot. Another joked quietly that maybe she'd learned something. No one laughed too loudly. This wasn't schadenfreude, it was relief. What had shocked everyone wasn't just the ticket or the fine. It was the fact that entitlement had finally hit a wall and didn't bounce back. The cop hadn't raised his voice, hadn't threatened, hadn't escalated. He'd simply applied the law evenly and without bias. And in doing so, he dismantled the assumption that confidence and outrage could override rules meant to protect others. The lesson lingered long after the cars were gone. Some lines exist for a reason, and crossing them, no matter how sure you are of yourself, comes with consequences. The days after the incident carried an unusual calm, the kind that follows a public reckoning. Word traveled fast through the neighborhood and beyond the community center. People who hadn't been there heard about it anyway. How Karen parked in a handicapped spot without a permit, how she argued, and how the cop didn't budge an inch. The story spread not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. Accountability stories always travel farther than excuses. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to retreat. She stopped attending events at the community center for a while, at least during peak hours. When she did show up, she parked far from the entrance, double-checking signs before leaving her car. The confidence that once defined her movements was replaced with something quieter and more cautious. She spoke less, avoided eye contact, and no longer challenged people openly. The ticket hadn't just cost her money, it had cost her certainty. The HOA board felt the ripple effects too. At the next meeting, handicapped parking was added to the agenda, something that had never happened before. The discussion was stiff and formal, stripped of the usual posturing. One board member read aloud the relevant regulations, emphasizing that enforcement was not optional and that violations reflected poorly on the entire community. No one mentioned Karen by name, but everyone knew exactly why the topic had surfaced. Residents responded differently now. People paid attention to signage. They corrected guests before mistakes happened. A few even shared information about how to apply for temporary permits if someone had an injury or mobility issue. What had once been treated as a minor inconvenience was now understood as a serious matter. The change wasn't driven by fear of fines, but by a renewed sense of respect. The woman with the cane became an unspoken symbol of the shift. Neighbors greeted her more warmly. Doors were held open more often. Parking spots closer to entrances were left intentionally free. It wasn't charity or guilt, it was awareness. One small incident had reminded everyone that accessibility isn't about rules on paper, but about real people navigating real limitations. Karen's reputation, however, didn't recover so easily. Even when she tried to reassert herself in unrelated matters, complaining about noise, questioning minor HOA decisions, people listened differently. Her authority, once assumed, now felt fragile. There was a quiet understanding that if she could be wrong so publicly about something so obvious, she could be wrong about other things too. Confidence alone was no longer convincing. What stood out most was how little the officer had needed to do to create lasting change. There was no lecture, no humiliation, no spectacle. Just a calm application of the law, applied evenly and without exception. That restraint made the outcome stronger. Karen couldn't frame herself as a victim of aggression or bias. The facts were too clear, the process too clean. In private conversations, people admitted they'd seen similar behavior before but had stayed silent, assuming it wasn't worth the hassle. The incident challenged that mindset. It showed that speaking up, even once, could matter. Not because it punished someone, but because it corrected a pattern. Entitlement thrives in silence. It weakens when met with clarity. By the end of the week, the handicapped spot was no longer just paint on asphalt. It had become a visible boundary, one that people respected instinctively. Drivers slowed when passing it. Pedestrians glanced at it with understanding. It stood as a quiet reminder that some rules aren't negotiable, no matter who you are or how important you think your schedule might be. Karen learned that lesson the hard way. And the rest of the community learned it together, without shouting, without conflict, and without forgetting. In the weeks that followed, the incident settled into local memory as more than just a parking violation. It became a reference point, a moment people quietly pointed to when discussing respect, rules, and shared responsibility. The handicapped spot remained unchanged, but its meaning had deepened. It was no longer just a legal designation, it was a reminder of how easily convenience can turn into disregard, and how quickly that disregard can be corrected when accountability appears. Karen never openly addressed what happened. She didn't apologize, didn't explain, didn't try to rewrite the narrative. Instead, she adjusted. Her behavior shifted in small but noticeable ways. She followed posted rules more carefully, avoided confrontations, and kept interactions brief. The entitlement that once defined her presence was muted, replaced by caution. People noticed, not with satisfaction, but with quiet acknowledgement. The lesson had landed. The community itself felt subtly stronger. Conversations about accessibility became more common, not in dramatic ways, but in practical ones. Someone mentioned helping a relative apply for a temporary permit. Another shared tips about accessible entrances around town. These weren't performative gestures. They were simple, thoughtful changes sparked by awareness. One moment of enforcement had triggered a chain reaction of consideration. The officer, though long gone, remained part of the story. People spoke about him with respect, not because he had punished someone, but because he had handled the situation without ego. He hadn't escalated, hadn't embarrassed Karen, and hadn't treated the crowd like an audience. He'd simply done his job, calmly and correctly. That professionalism made the outcome unquestionable. There was no argument left to have. Looking back, what shocked everyone wasn't the fine, the ticket, or even Karen's reaction. It was how quickly power shifted when rules were applied evenly. For so long, Karen's confidence had been mistaken for authority. The moment that illusion was tested, it collapsed. Not dramatically, not explosively, but completely. Authority, without legitimacy, doesn't need to be challenged loudly. It just needs to be measured against reality. The woman with the cane continued attending events, now parking easily and without stress. She never commented on the incident, never sought attention for it. Her quiet presence was enough. Each time someone saw her using the space as intended, it reinforced why the rule existed. The story stopped being about Karen and became about her, the person the spot was actually meant for. Over time, the incident faded from daily conversation, but its impact didn't. People checked themselves more often. They paused before bending rules. They spoke up gently when they saw something wrong. Not out of anger, but out of understanding. The community had learned that accountability doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it just requires someone willing to make the call and someone willing to enforce the answer. Karen became just another resident again. Not feared, not followed, not deferred to. Equal. And in a way, that was the most lasting consequence. She hadn't been humiliated or publicly shamed, but she had been reminded that no one stands above rules designed to protect others. That realization lingered long after the ticket was paid. In the end, The shock wasn't about what the cop did. It was about what he didn't do.
He didn't argue.
He didn't threaten. He didn't back down. He applied the law, fairly and without exception. And in doing so, he restored balance, not just to a parking lot, but to a community that needed the reminder. Some lessons arrive loudly. Others arrive quietly and stay forever. This one did exactly that.